Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into some incredibly disturbing news that unfolded in Minnesota this past Saturday, June 14th, 2025.
Yeah, really disturbing. State lawmakers shot in their own homes.
And officials are calling these targeted attacks, which is chilling enough, but there's one specific detail that really jumps out from the sources we have.
Just those.
The shooter was reportedly impersonating law enforcement.
Ah, yeah. That detail about the impersonation tactic is particularly chilling, isn't it? It speaks to a deliberate strategy, really, designed to overcome security and instill a false sense of safety.
Absolutely. It just changes everything.
Yeah.
Our sources confirm the victims mentioned are State Senator John Hoffman of Champlin
Right.
and State Representative and Speaker Emerita Melissa Hortman of Brooklyn Park.
Okay.
Tragically, their spouses were also shot in these incidents. These happened early Saturday morning at their homes in those two separate locations.
Right. So for this deep dive, you've given us quite a stack of sources to work through.
We have.
We've got news reports from outlets like KNS5 and Fox 9 sort of giving us the raw facts as they came in, plus information compiled on Wikipedia, which helps aggregate those initial reports, you know?
Yeah, it brings it together. And critically, we're also looking at analysis from a CSIS brief and a Journal of Democracy article.
Okay, those sound important.
They are key because they help us put this specific event into a much broader context. You know, political violence, domestic terrorism trends, that kind of thing.
Got it. Context is crucial here.
Plus, we've got some reactions captured from online discussions, specifically on Reddit's Our Prepper Intel forum. So a mix of news, analysis, and sort of public reaction.
Okay. So our mission today basically is to take all this material and understand the Minnesota shootings not just as a standalone crime, horrifying as it is, but to see how experts and commentators through these sources view it within that larger concerning landscape of political violence.
Exactly. We want to understand what happened, for sure, but then explore why these sources suggest it's connected to a much bigger picture.
Makes sense. Where should we start?
Let's start by really drilling down on what the sources tell us actually happened in Minnesota, the specifics.
Okay. Based on the news reports and Wikipedia, the core facts are quite stark. 2 state lawmakers, their spouses, shot in their homes early Saturday morning, June 14th, 2025.
And officials were quick to label these as targeted attacks.
Yeah.
That word targeted seems really significant.
It does. It implies motive, planning.
And that tactic we mentioned, the impersonation, it's just horrifying. And it's highlighted across nearly all the sources we have. KNS5, Wikipedia, FOX 9, the Targeted Attacks Q&A, Reddit. They all note it.
Yeah, the suspect was believed to be impersonating law enforcement. The Targeted Attacks Q&A source even gets into detail on this.
Like what?
Suggesting the suspect might have been dressed in body armor worn over, like a blue shirt and pants, standard enough to maybe look plausible at first glance.
Wow.
And this is why emergency alerts went out, right? As noted in the Targeted Attacks Q&A and on Reddit, advising residents to be extremely cautious, verify the identity of anyone claiming to be law enforcement.
They even suggested calling 911 to confirm.
Exactly, which tells you how serious the authorities took this deception tactic.
That level of detail in the alerts really underscores how deliberately this tactic was used. To deceive, gain access, it bypasses the normal barriers someone might have up.
Totally. As for the suspects, Wikipedia and the Targeted Attacks Q&A mentioned that one suspect was reportedly taken into custody after an officer-involved shooting.
Okay, so one in custody.
But crucially, at least one other suspect remained at large. That's why we saw shelter-in-place orders in areas like Brooklyn Park, according to Wikipedia. Uncertainty, danger is still out there.
And the human element here is just devastating. KMSP-TV reported via Wikipedia said both Senator Hoffman and Representative Hortman were in grave condition, shot multiple times.
Just awful, grave condition.
Yeah. And the official response, it seems, was swift and serious.
It was. KNS5, Wikipedia, Reddit all mentioned Governor Tim Walz being immediately briefed. And activating the State Emergency Operations Center, which, signals the high level of concern from authorities. This isn't just a local crime scene response.
No, clearly not. Okay, so we have the specific, deeply troubling details of this event. But like you said, the analysis sources make clear to truly understand it, we need to zoom out. Look at the landscape these attacks occurred within. How do these sources define political violence? How do they categorize it?
Good question. The CSIS brief gives us a working definition. It's basically the deliberate use or threat of violence by non-state actors.
Okay, non-state actors.
Aimed at achieving political goals. And importantly, creating a broad psychological impact. It's not just the physical harm, it's the message, the fear it spreads.
Okay, that makes sense. And they break this down into specific types, right?
They do. The broad categories they discuss are right-wing, left-wing, religious, and ethno-nationalist. But there's a critical insight from the CSIS source here.
Which is?
These terms, right-wing, left-wing, they don't align with mainstream political parties. Not talking about Republicans or Democrats here.
That's a really important distinction. Often gets lost, doesn't it?
Totally. They are labels for small extremist minorities who operate outside the political mainstream, even though they sometimes co-opt political rhetoric, you know?
Right. Okay, so with those definitions in mind, how do these analysis sources connect that back to what happened in Minnesota specifically?
Well, both the targeted attacks Q&A document and discussions captured on Reddit explicitly identify the Minnesota shootings as targeted attacks against Democratic lawmakers.
Right. The victim's party affiliation was noted early.
Exactly. And the targeted attacks Q&A source notes this indicates the victims were specifically chosen because of their political roles and affiliations. It wasn't random.
Which fits that definition of political violence aimed at political goals.
Precisely. And the reaction captured in that targeted attacks Q&A suggests this event is seen as more than just a violent crime, even a politically motivated one. Some commentators cited there view it as a massive escalation in political violence. And because of the political targeting and the likely psychological impact, they are labeling it a terrorist attack.
Wow. Yeah.
So this underscores how these sources see it fitting that definition, violence aimed at instilling fear, achieving a political end, even if the specific goals aren't immediately clear.
It certainly feels like an escalation, just hearing about the details, the impersonation. Do the sources provide data on whether political violence is broadly increasing in the U.S.? Is this part of a trend?
They absolutely do. And the trend is incredibly concerning. The Journal of Democracy source, looking at data up to their October 2021 analysis, states point blank that acts of political violence in the U.S. have skyrocketed in the last 5 years.
Skyrocketed. Yeah, that's a strong word.
It is. And the CSIS data gives us more granular detail on who is carrying out this violence, broken down by ideology. The CSIS analysis, covering a long period 1994 up to May 2020, found that right-wing terrorism accounted for the significant majority of incidents, about 57%.
Okay, 57%. How does that compare?
Substantially more than left-wing terrorism, which is 25% over that same period. Others, like religious or ethno-nationalist, made up the rest.
And does the trend show that imbalance has actually accelerated recently? Or is it steady?
That's the key takeaway from the more recent CSIS data within that time frame. They highlight substantial growth in right-wing incidents in the 6 years leading up to May 2020.
Significant growth.
Yeah. In fact, just in the first few months of 2020 alone, January 1st to May 8th, right-wing extremists were reportedly responsible for over 90% of reported attacks and plots in the U.S.
90% in early 2020.
According to that CSIS data analysis, yeah. So the insight isn't just that violence is increasing, but according to these sources, where the concentration of that increase lies.
Okay. The Journal of Democracy also talks about a shift, doesn't it, in what or who is being targeted over time.
It does. Historically, thinking back to maybe the 60s and 70s, political violence from the far left often focused more on property damage, bombings of buildings, that kind of thing.
All right, symbolic targets.
But the Journal of Democracy notes that as political violence shifted more rightward, starting maybe in the late 70s onwards, the targets increasingly became people, minorities, abortion providers, government representatives like federal agents.
And the CSIS data kind of brings that picture up to date. What are the recent targets?
It does. Since 2014, CSIS observations show that right-wing targets frequently include individuals based on their religion, race, or ethnicity. Also, religious institutions and, importantly, government and police targets.
Which seems to align with targeting lawmakers like we saw in Minnesota, as discussed in the Q&A source.
Exactly. Fits that pattern identified in the source material.
There's another shift. The Journal of Democracy mentioned something about how these groups are organized, or maybe not organized anymore.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. They introduced this concept of ungrouping.
Ungrouping.
Yeah. The idea is that the nature of political violence is changing. It's becoming less about formal, structured organizations, groups with clear leaders and hierarchies, and more about decentralized individuals, people who self-radicalize, often online.
The lone wolf idea. but maybe more widespread.
Sort of, but it emphasizes the lack of formal group structure. This makes it much harder for law enforcement and intelligence agencies to track and disrupt, which is a significant insight into the challenge this type of violence presents today.
Okay, so we've got violence skyrocketing, shifting targets towards people and government figures, and perpetrators who are harder to track due to this ungrouping. What are the underlying factors? What, according to these sources, contributes to this dangerous environment? It's clearly complex, right? Not just one thing.
Absolutely not just one thing. The sources point to multiple interacting dynamics. The Journal of Democracy, for instance, strongly links elevated risk to highly competitive elections and deep partisan division.
Okay, polarization.
Yeah, especially when that division is based on identity, things like geographic splits, racial divides, religious differences that reinforce the political sorting we see. Where you live, who you are, increasingly predicts your politics.
They even cite some interesting data related to identity and political views, don't they?
They do. They reference a 2016 Pew data point showing that almost a third, 32% of U.S. citizens believed being U.S.-born and Christian was necessary to be considered a real American.
Mm-hmm.
And they noted higher percentages among Trump primary voters in a separate 2017 analysis mentioned in the journal. The argument that Jody makes is that our electoral institutions, the way we run elections, might actually intensify these identity-based cleavages rather than bridging them.
So the system itself might be part of the stress.
That's a crucial insight they offer, yeah, that the way the system is structured could exacerbate the problem.
Beyond identity and elections, institutional weaknesses are also flagged as a contributing factor in the Journal of Democracy piece.
Right. They detail what they call weak institutional constraints. This includes challenges inherent in presidential systems, like resolving disputes between the executive and legislative branches, think shutdowns, impasses.
Okay.
Also, recent state laws that centralize more power in partisan legislatures, potentially overriding local or executive decisions, and the worrying trend of politicization within law enforcement and the courts.
And they provide some specific data points on that last one about law enforcement. That seems really critical.
They do. They cite ACLED data, that's the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, indicating that police used far greater force against left-wing protests compared to right-wing ones back in 2020.
That's a stark finding.
It is. And interestingly, they also note that police union donations tilted significantly Republican in 2020. The insight here isn't necessarily about individual officers, but about institutional perception and trust. If institutions like law enforcement are perceived as or actually become partisan, it erodes public trust across the board.
And that could exacerbate tensions.
Potentially, yeah. It could contribute to an environment where some extremists feel that non-state violence is their only recourse if they don't trust the state's institutions to be neutral.
The CSIS brief also adds a few broader societal issues that extremists might sort of latch onto, right?
Yeah, they briefly mention factors like economic inequality, social isolation or loneliness, specific polarizing events, or even societal responses to things like the COVID-19 pandemic.
How do those fit in?
The idea isn't that these things cause extremism directly, but that they can be elements that extremists exploit or use as justifications for their actions or their worldview. They can be co-opted by extremist narratives.
Okay. When we talk about things being co-opted and this idea of self-radicalization, the role of political rhetoric and what happens online becomes incredibly relevant, doesn't it?
Absolutely crucial. And this brings us to a concept mentioned in both of the main analysis sources, stochastic terrorism.
Stochastic terrorism. Explain that.
The idea, discussed in both the Targeted Attacks Q&A and the Journal of Democracy, is that even without giving direct orders for violence, political rhetoric can be so heated, so dehumanizing, that it unpredictably inspires unstable or already radicalized individuals to commit violent acts. It's like, it's the statistical likelihood that inflammatory speech will lead someone somewhere to violence, even if you don't know who or when or how. The rhetoric loads the gun, basically.
That's a powerful and, frankly, pretty concerning idea, especially with the reach of online media. And the sources mention specific ideological frameworks that this kind of rhetoric plugs into.
They do. The CSIS source lists various extremist ideologies they track as potential frameworks. On the right, they mention white supremacists, anti-government movements like militias, sovereign citizens.
Those who think they're outside government authority.
Exactly. Also groups like the Three Percenters and the Boogaloo movement, which anticipates a second civil war. On the left, they mention anarchists, some environmental or animal rights extremists, and Antifa.
So a range of ideologies.
Yes, and the insight is that rhetoric doesn't happen in a vacuum. It lands on individuals who might already be predisposed by these ideologies. And many of these are decentralized, which reinforces that ungrouping trend we talked about. It's individuals connecting with ideas online.
And the Reddit source, the Our Proper Intel thread, gives us a kind of real-time glimpse into how events like the Minnesota shootings are discussed in certain online spaces, right?
Yeah.
Even if we have to be careful interpreting it.
Exactly. Looking impartially at that thread, just reporting what's there, we see the immediate aftermath discussions.
Yeah.
There's definitely concern about the police impersonation tactic, what it means for personal safety.
Makes sense.
There's immediate speculation about the victims being Democrats and what that signifies about the motive. Was it political targeting?
And it doesn't take long for, well, accusations and conspiracy theories to surface in those kinds of spaces, does it?
No. The source shows discussions quickly shifting to false flags, suggesting the attacks were actually staged by the deep state, or maybe Antifa, to discredit opponents. There's also commentary linking it to political figures like Trump or policy frameworks like Project 2025. The Targeted Attacks Q&A specifically notes Project 2025 being brought up in some online discussions, tied to concerns about potential authoritarianism or media control.
And worryingly, discussions about whether political violence could ever be justified.
Yes, that crops up too in the Reddit source material. Debates about whether the current political climate justifies extreme actions. The thread really is a snapshot of how quickly these tragic events get filtered through existing biases, fears, and narratives online.
It reflects the environment where that idea of stochastic terrorism could take root, doesn't it? We're not endorsing these views, obviously, just reporting that the source shows these discussions happening immediately.
Precisely. It illustrates the online ecosystem where the ungrouping happens, where inflammatory rhetoric lands directly on individuals, and where events are instantly interpreted through these polarized lenses.
Okay, so given this troubling picture, escalating violence, complex causes, online radicalization, what do the sources suggest can actually be done? What responses or mitigation strategies are discussed?
Several paths are suggested across the sources. Both the Targeted Attacks Q&A and the Journal of Democracy emphasize the need for swift and certain justice.
For the perpetrator?
Yes,
right.
For those who commit violence, but also for those engaging in incitement and making credible threats against officials. The insight here is that impunity, letting this stuff slide, just normalizes the behavior and encourages more of it.
Makes sense. Do they suggest specific legal measures?
Yes. Strengthening laws against harassment and intimidation is mentioned in both sources as a way to protect public figures and, frankly, anyone involved in civic life. The Targeted Attacks Q&A also raises the idea of inoculating individuals against extremism.
Inoculating, like a vaccine.
Kind of. Especially targeting younger people. Teaching critical thinking skills, media literacy, how to recognize propaganda and resist extremist indoctrination online. Building resilience to it.
That seems important long-term. Now, a really critical point across the analysis sources seems to be the responsibility of political leaders themselves.
Absolutely essential. Highlighted in both the Targeted Attacks Q&A and the Journal of Democracy. They argue it is crucial for political leaders to explicitly denounce violence.
Generally.
No, specifically violence from their own side, from within their own political movement or party.
Why is that distinction so important?
Because the insight is that partisans, people strongly aligned with one side, are far more likely to listen to and be influenced by leaders within their own political alignment. Denunciations from opponents often just get dismissed as political attacks.
So silence or equivocation from leaders about violence on their side is seen as really damaging.
Incredibly damaging, according to these sources. It can be interpreted as tacit approval.
The Journal of Democracy also delves into deeper, more systemic changes, doesn't it? Beyond just condemning violence.
It does. They suggest reforms aimed at shoring up election credibility. They mention ideas like provisions in the proposed Freedom to Vote Act, although they also note that such efforts are themselves highly politicized, which is part of the problem.
Bit of a catch-22 there.
Yeah. They also discuss changing electoral rules, maybe things that could encourage broader, more moderate coalitions or increase representation, like ranked choice voting ideas, and police reform.
What kind of police reform?
Who focused on better training, particularly on understanding and gathering intelligence on domestic extremism, also on increasing representation within law enforcement to better reflect the communities they serve, hopefully building trust.
Okay, so several potential avenues. From legal changes to leadership responsibility to systemic reforms. Finally, let's look at the current risk landscape as these sources portray it. What does all this data and analysis mean for the immediate future? How worried should we be?
Well, the Journal of Democracy presents some truly sobering survey data from early 2020 and 2021. It's pretty stark. A significant percentage of Americans in February 2021, that was reportedly a fifth of Republicans and 13% of Democrats, which translates to over 65 million people, believed that immediate violence was justified to save the country, essentially.
Believe violence was justified now?
Yes. And even more concerning, similar percentages in a Feb 2020 survey believed it was a little justified to actually kill opposing political leaders.
Those numbers are hard to process. Just incredibly difficult to hear.
There are deeply disturbing findings reported in the source, and they add another layer by mentioning increased armament in the population.
More guns.
The Journal of Democracy points out that a substantial portion of gun sales back in 2020 were to first-time buyers. And notably, this included demographics not traditionally associated with high rates of gun ownership, like women and African Americans.
So a broader segment of the population is becoming armed.
That's the insight, yeah. Potentially in response to perceived threats, instability, maybe a loss of faith in institutions to protect them.
So if you put those 2 points together, a significant willingness among millions to justify political violence and increasing armament across the population, that paints a very, very concerning picture for the future.
It absolutely does. The Journal of Democracy expresses serious concern based on this analysis, with segments on both sides increasingly armed and holding deeply dehumanizing views of their political opponents.
Which fuels the justification for violence.
Exactly. The possibility of decentralized tit-for-tat street violence or more targeted attacks like the ones in Minnesota grows significantly. That's the fear expressed in the source.
And the ultimate warning these sources seem to leave us with is about the process of normalization, right? That this becomes seen as just part of politics.
Yes. That's a key takeaway from the Journal of Democracy. They argue that political violence, even if it's currently less prevalent overall than in some other countries or historical periods, has a corrosive effect. It fuels itself. They state very clearly that the most significant factor normalizing future political violence is the presence of political violence now. Each incident makes the next one seem a little less shocking, a little more possible.
So, to wrap up, this deep dive, guided by the sources you provided, has shown us that the horrific shootings in Minnesota are seen by experts and commentators not as some isolated anomaly, but as a stark, deeply disturbing example.
Yeah, an example that fits within a larger escalating trend of political violence in the United States, according to this material.
A trend that these sources suggest is driven by a complex interplay of intense political polarization, divisions based on identity, weaknesses in our institutions,
and the potent influence of political rhetoric, especially amplified in a decentralized online world.
It really highlights how individual tragedies, like the one in Minnesota, can be viewed as flashpoints within these broader, dangerous currents flowing through society, as described by these analysts.
It's a sobering connection to make.
And so the sources really leave us, and you listening, with a powerful question to think about. Given this material suggesting that political violence can normalize itself over time, and that a significant number of Americans across the political spectrum are disturbingly willing to justify it, how might understanding these dynamics influence how we individually respond to political tension, to the rhetoric we encounter online or in our own communities?
What does that potential for violence to normalize, as discussed in these sources, truly mean for the future of how we engage in political discourse, how we participate in civic life in this country? It's a challenge these sources suggest we all need to grapple with urgently.